This is Broken Truth with Clint Nollers and John Davidson, and today we have David Fleck, who is going to teach us all about fraud and his service that helps prevent fraud, especially with notaries. Welcome, David.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
David, can you give us kind of a CV of your history and what you do now?
Sure. So I've been a lawyer for, I think this is my 25th year, if I do my math right. And in my first position, I was at the U.S. Customs Service, handling at a very low level, international fraud, import fraud, that kind of thing. I say at a low level because I only stayed there 2 years before I went to the LA District Attorney's Office, which I always wanted to do. And just by accident, about 3 years into my career as a prosecutor, I started handling fraud cases, paper cases, as prosecutors call them, and loved it. I loved digging. It sounds crazy, but I loved digging through the paperwork to find the smoking gun. And the more you do of something, the better you become at it. And the fact is, local prosecutors tend to not enjoy handling fraud cases. And so the fact that I wanted to do it, it just meant more and more cases came my way. And eventually I ended up in the real estate fraud section in downtown Los Angeles. And then when I left the district attorney's office in 2009 and started my own practice, because of that background, fraud victims kept coming to me. The bulk of them were victims of various kinds of real estate fraud, title theft, although I did have a fair number of other types of victims of investment fraud, embezzlement, and the like. And then about 3 years ago, I guess 3.5 years ago now, I stopped taking on new clients because I wanted to focus on building a company called Veritable Data Solutions that would develop technology to prevent fraud before it happens. And so that's where I find myself today. Although I still get a lot of calls from potential clients that I have to refer out to other attorneys. And I'm always happy to do that, I should add. I'm always happy to talk to people about their situation and help them find the right attorney. So,
great. So how does your system that you have designed work?
Okay, so our first application is an app, a phone app for notaries. This is kind of a long explanation, but you may have heard advertisements on TV for title monitoring services. The biggest one is Home Title Lock, and they've actually asked me to be in a couple of their commercials as the expert. I apologize for that. I thought I turned off the notifications.
It's all good.
Anyway, Home Title Lock asked me to be the legal expert about home title theft because it's a type of case I've been handling for a long time. And the bottom line is this: it's very easy to steal, and I'm going to put steal in quotes, and I'll explain that in a second, to steal home titles. The reason I put it in quotes is that to steal home titles, you have to forge documents generally. And forged documents cannot convey good title. So legally, it's not possible to steal home titles, but it sure feels like it to victims. So let me roll back just a second. Before, about 20 or 25 years ago, home title theft was really unheard of because it was so difficult to forge believable deeds, make credible forgeries. You had to have special printing equipment. But nowadays, literally every desktop computer or laptop has the technology to make believable forgeries. And so this is a problem that's growing bigger and bigger, literally every year, because more and more criminal organizations are discovering how easy it is to commit this crime. Now, the reason our first app focused on notaries is they have historically been the guardians against this kind of fraud. If you think about it, what does a notary do? Well, I'll ask you, what does a notary do, John?
Notary confirms identity and oversees the signature of official documents and then puts a seal on it so that you can go back to the notary? No?
So that you are spot on. You got it exactly right. I mean, it's so important to know that the true owner of a property is the one who's actually signing the deed, not some imposter, right? And so that's what the notary does. They are supposed to verify your identity and make sure that you are actually the person who's supposed to be signing that deed. And then they put their stamp on the document so subsequent viewers of the deed know that it's been notarized, the identities have been properly verified. That stamp is the proof of authenticity. But forged documents defeat all of that. I mean, you can buy a fake notary stamp online, no questions asked. I did for educational purposes. My notary is Joe Q Fraudster, and it says fake on it, but it cost me $14 and was delivered to my door in 3 days. No questions asked. I could have put any notary's name on there. I could have made up a fake notary. And the problem is that there's no easy way for title companies or lawyers or the county clerk's office to verify whether that stamp is real or fake. Right. So basically, modern technology has passed notaries up and undermined everything what they do for us.
So your app is the solution then? It's something that's going to bring notaries into this new age of technology?
That's right. We're a little bit different. My partner and I are a little bit different than other startup founders. We're a little older. And so younger startup founders tend to want to disrupt everything and, change the process entirely. They have no vested interest in what we're doing, what we've been doing for a long time. We see it differently. We wanted to empower notaries because they are already in the right position, in the right location, and the right place and time to stop this fraud. So we created an app that enables them to scan your driver's license or your passport and know within 20 seconds if it's real or fake. These are fake identity. I mean, the fake identities that you can buy online today can't be detected by the naked eye. They're that good. So our app gives them modern technology that enables them to figure out if a passport is real or fake, if a driver's license is real or fake. And then we invoke sort of the blockchain technology, the entire transaction, the verification of the person's identity, a snapshot, a selfie of the person signing, the fact that the notary was present and accounted for, the real notary, not some imposter with a fake stamp was present and accounted for. All of that data and pictures of the critical pages, the signature and the stamp, are all captured on our blockchain forever, immutably, unchangeable, protected, so that when the title company looks at the document or the county clerk's office or law enforcement looks at the document, they can confirm whether the paper document they have in their hand is the very same document that was signed by the true verified signer. So basically, we've brought notaries to the 21st century with our app. It's called Veri-Lock.
Okay.
Veri-Lock.
Yeah, I think the photograph is really important.
Oh, it is. I mean, it really is. And just storing that in a way that can't be changed, can't be tampered with. That's where blockchain technology comes in. The concept behind Web 3.0 is that we would each control all of our data, and so that nobody could sell it or use it or discover it without first getting our permission. Right. We're a long way from having that being, covering all of our data out there. I mean, there's just such a huge amount of data out there. We're a long ways off, but the concept makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's important that people like you are doing this because it seems to me that fraud has reached a point where there's just so much of it that it's like a tidal wave, and there are just not enough people that were doing your job as a prosecutor to fight it.
Well, that you hit the nail on the head with that last point there. There will never be enough investigators and prosecutors handling these cases because they're just time consuming and labor intensive to investigate. And, I had one detective tell me years ago that he could close something like 20 residential burglaries in the time it took him to close a single fraud case. So there really just will never be enough investigators. There just can't be. Sure. And so there will always be this. And so people have to be watching out for themselves. If a deal sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and there are ways to protect your identity and that type of thing to take care of yourself. And the other thing is, I mean, the most vulnerable victims in our society to fraud are elderly victims. Right. Not all of them, but, we all know some elderly folks who are slowing down and they can't handle their affairs as well as they used to. We need to be watching out for them because they are prime targets for con artists.
Well, especially with home health care now becoming a thing.
Exactly. Spot on.
The people are taking advantage. The home nurses, not all. I think most are probably great people. My aunt has really nice people that take care of her. but sometimes maybe not even just those healthcare workers, but maybe even the companies that hire them. My aunt had to go through all kinds of hoops with the company that was providing her home health care. And then they get purchased by another company that they don't know, and they started doing unusual things. I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And when you're older like that, you don't know how to use a web browser, much less navigate security issues.
That's absolutely correct. And I should add, it's not just private home health care providers, it's also family members. It's very common for one child to sort of bear the burden of taking care of mom and dad. And sometimes they feel entitled. I'm doing all this work, I deserve the house, that kind of thing. And, maybe morally they have an argument, maybe, but that's not the law. And it's often family members who are committing the fraud against their parents and their siblings.
Wow.
Yeah, power of attorney issues. There's so much of this that people were blind to, or, we trusted lawyers to handle everything for us. But, in the work that we do, it's difficult to find lawyers that want to get involved in anything regarding fraud.
I think the problem is that there are a lot of people crying wolf. Everybody who has a broken contract or things didn't work out the way they expected it to work out, they all want to claim fraud. And so it does. And honestly, from a lawyer's perspective, I hope I can say this, those people are really annoying. And you really want to just find, because you really want to help the true victims and people who are just, and sometimes it's the people who weren't really victims who are the loudest. Right. And so I understand that. The other thing is, you'll often find prosecutors who are reluctant to get involved in fraud cases because, as I mentioned earlier, most local prosecutors, they don't want to handle fraud cases. It's just kind of a culture thing. They want to handle the more visceral cases, Right. And so they're not anxious to jump into this. I really think that the bigger prosecutorial agencies should have a whole separate track for white collar prosecutors. Hires people specifically for that. People who want to do it, and maybe they don't stay forever. Maybe this is just a short term thing, and they go out to work for a big firm or something like that. That's okay, but there just needs to be a different method of handling these cases more efficiently and more effectively.
It's not legally required for notaries to take photographs.
No.
Right?
No, it's not.
Do you think that we could encourage our lawmakers to actually change the law to make that a mandatory thing? Is there any reason why we couldn't do that?
So I changed the law back in 2008. I wrote some legislation. When I first started dealing with these issues of title theft, I really focused on the notaries as kind of the bad guys. Because in several of my cases, they were just so sloppy and let the con artists take advantage of them and whatnot. And I just realized over the years that they are actually the victims too. And more often than not, when there's a notary involved in a fraud crime, they were duped into doing it by a very slick con artist, a slick talking con artist. But as far as the picture goes, so back in 2007, I wrote the legislation. I tried to get it passed in California that they would have to get a thumbprint for every single transaction. And what they did do is expand it to include powers of attorney. Prior to that, it was required in real estate transactions, and they expanded it to include powers of attorney, which is really important. If I can talk to you about a particular case, but back then you couldn't take pictures of high quality pictures of clients. Now everybody has a smartphone with a very high quality camera on it, and frankly, as a trial lawyer, I'd rather have a picture of the suspect than a thumbprint. With a picture, I just put it up on the screen and the jury can look at it, look at the person sitting at the table and say, oh yeah, that's the same guy. Yeah. With a thumbprint, I have to bring in an expert who starts talking about, this point and that point. It's like, oh gosh, I'd rather just have a picture. So that's why we incorporated it into our electronic notary journal. And for that reason. But yes, to answer your question, there are changes that need to be made. I will say that our notary journal will be most effective if it's used in every single transaction in a jurisdiction, in a city or a county or a state. That way they know, the county clerk or the title company knows that every document coming through has to have gone through this vetting process, basically. And I should say, it's not just us. I mean, our technology is kind of off the shelf. I mean, it's complicated to build and assemble, but we didn't create any new technology to do this. My partner and I, we found the problem, we knew the problem, and we went looking for the technology that would solve it. A lot of startups do the other way. They create a technology and they say, okay, what can we solve with this? And we did it the other way. So it's off the shelf. So it's not just us. I mean, legislation could be written that would be general enough that there could be other competitors in the space. Right now, nobody else has this solution. Nobody else has thought about it. Part of it is, and I don't mean this to toot my own horn, nobody has been in this fight as long as I have. I haven't found anybody, any lawyers or anybody else who has been fighting this kind of fraud for as long as I have. And, people will come and go. And I've just been thinking about it so much longer than anybody else that the solution was very apparent to me. Like I said, back in 2007, 2008, I wrote this legislation, but that was really just nibbling at the edges. Right. That's when I was kind of new to this, to understanding all of this. And that's, I feel like, where everybody else is now, where I was back then.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like you've got something that should really be the industry standard. And it makes me wonder if that could create, create demand for it just simply as practices. So you look 10 years down the road or something, in that time frame where everybody's using it and you don't necessarily need legislation. The question would become, why are you doing notarization without a photo, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's definitely a route we can take. And, we've been rolling this out to notaries first. It's free for notaries to use. I mean, they can all use it for free. I will tell you, there is a little bit of a challenge in California, and only California. The way California laws are written, notaries can't use electronic notary journals. It doesn't specifically say they can't. Without going into the details, it's been interpreted in a way that they can't use electronic notary journals. So we created a stripped down version of the process. Since they still have to use their paper journal, we didn't want to give them too much additional hassle. So we created a stripped down version of the process on our app for California notaries. But in every other state, they can simply use the journal on their iPhone or on their Galaxy as their journal. And so it is available to notaries nationwide.
I recall at the beginning of that, you talked about a woman who had her title stolen for a $650,000 home. What kind of restitution is there for victims of this?
Well, restitution is a criminal concept, a criminal law concept. That's where after a person is convicted, the judge orders them to pay back their victims. The problem with fraud and fraudsters is the money gets spent as quickly as it comes in. They're easy come, easy go. The con artist gets the money and they spend it. I mean, rarely, if ever, is it hiding somewhere that can be tapped into. So, I mean, it's not unheard of that criminals pay restitution. It does happen sometimes, but most of the time the money is gone. But in the case you're talking about, that was a case where my client inherited her childhood home and wasn't living there and just planned to fix it up and sell it. But before she could do that, somebody else swooped in, posed as her. In this case, it does appear that they had the cooperation of a notary, who participated as an accomplice, but posed as my client and sold the house to third-party investors, a flipping company, a legitimate flipping company who thought they were getting a good deal, intended to fix it up and sell it. So this flipping company got about a 35% discount over the fair market value. They got a hard money loan. The lender required title insurance, and they bought the house from the imposter. My client found out about it when her old neighbor said, "Oh, you're finally fixing up the house." She said, No, I haven't done anything. And she looked into it. And fortunately, she discovered it quickly. These crooks look for homes that are not cared for very well because they're hoping to have some time to get away. I mean, they did get away with the money. The money was gone and in the wind and laundered through multiple accounts within 2 days. But at the end of the day, it was the title company who had to pay out because The title company was the title policy was purchased to protect the lender, the hard money lender, in case there was any problem with title. Well, it turns out there was. And the fact is, title companies aren't in any better place to discover these kinds of forgeries than county clerks are. It's just so easy for these crooks to do it and get away with it. And with so few investigators out there, most of the time they get away with it without prosecution.
Well, so if it's so easy, then how does the average person protect themselves against this?
So our Veri-Lock app, if we can get that rolled out nationwide or similar technology nationwide, it'll put an end to it. It will be virtually impossible except for the most sophisticated actors, government level sophistication, hackers, that kind of thing. But the average Joe fraudster won't be able to do this, and that's who's committing these crimes. In the meantime, there are these what I would call stopgap measures. I mentioned Home Title Lock earlier. We actually have our own title monitoring service. These services monitor your title, and as soon as there's a change, they let you know. So you can quickly look and see if this is something you know about. Maybe you got a new mortgage. You're going to get notified about that. But you're also going to get notified if somebody forges a deed, like this client I was talking about. Somebody forges a deed and files it, you're going to get notified right away. And the sooner you react, the less severe the damage is. And let me come back to that in a second. But so many of these crimes are a multi-step process. First, they transfer title into their possession, or into their name, or into the name of a company they control, or into the name of an identity theft victim whose identity they are controlling. Then they do one of three things. They resell the house. They sell the house. They take a mortgage out against the house, or in some cases, they'll actually put tenants in there and just collect the rent. So there are different ways for them to take equity out of take value out of the house after they get control. The reason this is such a destructive crime is it's so hard to unwind it. Once that forged document is recorded with the county, the true homeowner can't sell or refinance their house. They are stuck. And the only way for them to get rid of that is to file a lawsuit. A lot of people think they can just go down to the county and say, hey, no, this is fraudulent, get rid of this deed. The county can't do that. I mean, in our system, it is the courts who evaluate whether something is, who's telling the truth, basically. They determine the facts of a situation. So you actually have to file a lawsuit and get that deed canceled by a judge. In some cases, it could even be a jury trial. So at a bare minimum, it's going to cost about $5,000. And that's if all the stars align, everything works out perfect in this lawsuit. There's no pushback from anybody else, a title company or anything like that. $5,000 in maybe 6 months. That's the bare minimum. But if you've ever been involved in a lawsuit, they take on a life of their own. The case we talked about earlier, that took 2 years. 2 years, and it cost tens of thousands of dollars for my client to get rid of that deed.
Would homeowners insurance, shouldn't that cover it?
No, homeowners insurance doesn't cover something like this. I will tell you that some title insurance policies do. So that's another subject. Title insurance, as you know, protects you against fraud before you buy the property. The job of the title insurance company is to do the due diligence on the seller. Right. Can you imagine if you had to do it yourself, figure out if the seller has authority to sell the property? Right. I mean, none of us would know how to do that. So we've offloaded that process to title insurance companies. They investigate the title history of the property, and if they're confident that this seller has the authority, well, then they will allow you to buy a policy, which says that if we're wrong, we'll pay to fix a situation. And you don't have to pay anything out of pocket. Most title insurance policies do not cover fraud that happens after you purchase the property, where somebody comes in and transfers ownership without your knowledge. But there is a policy out there that is available. I think, honestly, it's hard to get a straight answer. I've seen the policy. I've read the policy. I know the lawyers who wrote the policy. It was written first for First American title back in the late 90s, and then it became widespread and adopted by other title companies. But most people in the title industry don't even know about it, which is kind of weird to me. They don't even know it exists. But it does. So what I say to people is, if they got title insurance after 1998-ish, and if this happens to them, then the first thing they need to do is dig out their title insurance policy and see if they are covered for fraud after the purchase date. And if they are, they're sitting pretty. Just call your title insurance company, make a claim, let them handle it. If they're not, they've got to find an attorney who can handle this, who understands it and can deal with it. And that can be a little bit of a trick too. If you don't mind me explaining that.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
That can be a little bit of a trick too, finding the right attorney. Legally, the issues are not that complicated, but attorneys, like everybody, are kind of reluctant to believe that documents can just be outright forged like this. And if you don't find the right attorney who knows how to deal with that, you can get into a deeper hole. And that happened to a lady who called me about 6-7 months ago. This was a rough case. She'd owned her house for 25 years. She had a mortgage on it worth about half the value of the house. So a decent amount of equity in the house. And somebody forged foreclosure documents. It made it look like her house had been sold to them at a foreclosure sale and wiped out her interest. She didn't know this happened at all. But then they took those foreclosure deeds and they filed an unlawful detainer lawsuit against her. For those of your listeners who don't know, unlawful detainer is eviction. It's an eviction lawsuit. They filed an eviction lawsuit against her. Wow. It was at this point she hired a lawyer, and she didn't have a lot of money. So she hired a very young lawyer who was able to do it pretty cheaply and who didn't know what he was doing. Unfortunately, they ended up getting a judgment against her. And they were able to have the sheriff evict her from her own house.
Wow.
A lawyer, if she does eventually find a lawyer who can help her, then they're going to first have to deal with the eviction and all sorts of issues there, and then deal with the title documents. It's just a mess.
So should people be going through their looking at their title insurance and finding out, hey, this only protects me, it doesn't protect me after the fact, and then get new title insurance?
Shameless plug. I told you we have our own title monitoring service.
There we go.
Our members get that service for free. They can upload their title documents to us. We'll review it and let them know whether or not they are covered for this kind of fraud. And if they're not, we will refer them to a title company that can sell them a new policy that will cover it.
Okay.
Now, if you have, say, a mortgage with a bank, doesn't that offer you some security because the bank is monitoring their investment?
A little bit. What I would say is, the lady I was just talking about, that mortgage company at some point will come in and they're going to have to clean this up because they need to protect their asset, their collateral for their loan. And so hopefully she will get some relief from that. Maybe she can hire another lawyer at that point who will sort of ride on the bank's coattails. When I talked to her, she still wasn't fully grasping the situation and refused to tell her mortgage company what was going on. She thought it would harm her some way, and and that's not unusual. I mean, with older folks, they're different.
Yeah.
They're varying levels of competence as we get older. We all want to think that we're going to be competent until the day we die, but we're just not. Some of us are not.
Some of us are not competent at our young age.
Exactly.
I have conflicting feelings about the entire industry of real estate in general. But I used to joke about title insurance. It's like, what, they're going to have a wreck with it in a car on the way over to the bank? I mean, I wasn't aware that this was this was in play. I mean, and I talked to a clerk of courts, family member of a clerk of courts, and she's like, well, we're not required to check the signatures of the buyer and seller.
No.
So that's how you can get away with a lot of this. They do check the notaries. But I think you found me because I was trying to get information about how people could forge a notary.
Well, can I ask you a quick question? How do they check the notaries? What does that even mean?
Well, at least in California, you can download a list of all notaries in the state, and then you can corroborate their address and are they still legal and licensed.
How would they have any idea if the notary's stamp was forged?
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't.
I mean, if you can imagine how the fraud takes place, it's probably already taken place.
It takes place all the time.
Yeah,
it does.
That's a good point.
I had some clients. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, like the one idea that I had, which I kind of mentioned to you, was like, okay, so what if you either stole the mail, like say you had a retired notary, and I don't understand the process. Maybe the process is protected, but from what I've seen with the Secretary of State in California, it's probably not. If you say rented an apartment that had an address for a retired notary who was either deceased or retired or whatever, hadn't renewed, as long as you have access to the mailbox, or maybe you even forward the mail away from that address, which happens all the time, and you renew online, does the state even bother to like get a photograph of you? Do they even take any steps to sort of prevent that? So, let's say I just took my neighbor's mail and renewed an old deceased notary who used that address 20 years ago. Is that kind of how that would work? And then suddenly now I have a notary, power of notary, I have the stamp and everything I need to do to forge documents as if I were the person who used to live next door. And then when I've committed my crimes, if the heat starts coming up, I just dump the stuff and it's like it never happened and I'm not associated with it. Did I just invent a new crime?
You're starting to think like a con artist, John.
Well, I did work in Hollywood for 20 years. So
that's funny.
That'll do it.
You could certainly do that, and that's very similar to creating a synthetic identity that you then dump when the heat turns up. And I know of one con artist who's now in prison, thankfully. But what he used to do is he used to find defunct corporations, California corporations, and just start using their name. To try to distract, distract the dogs, send them off on another trail away from him. So that's kind of similar to what you're talking about. You could certainly do that.
Well, I checked.
I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it, John.
Well, I've found so much of this kind of stuff that I had to start asking questions. And what I really try to do is when I see things that don't make sense, I try to reverse engineer what it could be. How could this possibly happen? So yeah, there's so much of this kind of stuff that I've been wandering into. I went to the Secretary of State's office in California, called him up, and I said, how do you verify the identities of directors and board members, or let's say it's president, secretary, treasurer, and vice president, right? For every corporation. I said, how do you verify their identities on documents for corporate structure in California? And they said, hold on a second. And I could just imagine this scene where they were looking around going, he wants to know how we verify the names of the people on the documentation. And then you can say, we don't do that. Are we supposed to do that? I don't know. Just tell them we don't do it. Yeah, we don't do that. So you could just, you're Elon Musk now. You can make Tesla motors too.
So I had a client a while back. He was a foreign national who owned property down here in Los Angeles, Los Angeles County, I'll say. And he had an ex-girlfriend who was not happy with him, who lived down here, who with the help of a friend forged statements of information that she filed with the California Secretary of State, and that named her as now the CEO of the LLCs that owned his properties. Actually, at that time he held them as corporations, but anyway, details. He she made herself the CEO, and then once she was the CEO of the properties, she took those statements of information to a bank and took mortgages out, sucked out all the equity out of all of his properties down here in Los Angeles.
And then there's no, what happens? Can the bank and the title company that did the mortgage should have caught that, right?
How
do the banks get protected? Because at the end of the day, the banks are going to pretty much win anything. So did he just lose his property?
She was on the hook. Those mortgages were invalid because they were based on essentially forged documents. So they had no valid interest in the property. So at the end of the day, after a lot of money, it got cleared up from my client's perspective. But it was a mess, and it was a very expensive mess.
There seems to be like a need at the state level, or maybe even the federal level, to protect us from this kind of white collar crime. And there's not. But you can't throw a football on the beach in Los Angeles County.
Yeah. That's not, I disagree with you a little bit. There are always attempts to close, to plug the holes that the white collar criminals are going through. After the 2008 crisis, there was a lot of legislation in the real estate industry to prevent certain types of fraud. They changed the regulations for the appraisal industry, for example, to make it harder to get them to inflate values and that kind of things. The problem is, con artists are like rain on the roof. They're gonna find that hole and get in, and they always do. And they're always, we're always trying to play catch up. The most embarrassing scandal that you don't hear about at all is what happened with the unemployment benefits in California last year, right? I don't know if you did a show on that, but it's shocking. At least $11 billion, at least the bare minimum of $11 billion was paid out in fraudulent claims, and possibly up to $30 billion.
Wow.
Right.
Why hasn't anybody been fired for that? Even if they, at some point there should have been, somebody should have caught that early, figured out what was going on. I don't know what the solution is, but somebody should have gotten fired over that. $30 billion just evaporating from the state budget.
Right.
So I do think they tried. I do think generally there's law enforcement officers around the world, around the country, who are always putting forth legislation to try to plug these holes. But the crooks are always one step ahead, looking for a new angle. Like title theft. Title theft is relatively new. You couldn't do it before about 20, 25 years ago. Now, my friends in law enforcement tell me that organized crime has discovered it. And once organized crime has discovered it, it's just going to get worse and worse.
They're gonna break the loophole because they're gonna flood it, and people will eventually rise up and.
Right.
Maybe I don't know. It seems like this country we've lost our ability to actually give a crap about this kind of stuff. Everybody seems to be in on it.
When Lance Armstrong got caught doping, it turns out every year that he won, 7 of the top 10 finishers were all doping too. So if everybody else is doing it, you've got to do it just to compete on their, at that level, right?
Yeah,
or at least that's how people rationalize it anyway.
And when I found out that professional wrestlers on television use steroids, what a shock. Is there any integrity left in the world?
That's very funny. I will tell you one thing, though. You guys are down in Orange County, and you guys have a very good fraud unit in your DA's office down there.
Really?
So good that law enforcement officers from neighboring counties will bring them cases. If they can find any kind of nexus to Orange County, they'll bring the cases to Orange County because they've got good prosecutors and good investigators.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I may have to reach out to them because I have so many questions, and maybe they have some answers for me. So what do you think about... you know what a registered agent is, obviously. Have you ever heard of anyone hijacking the address of a registered agent?
I haven't heard of that, but why not? Yeah, it could. I mean, these kinds of things could certainly happen.
Are you familiar with some of the big names in registered agency? I guess like CSC. There's one of the other ones that I was doing research on, and I kept coming across a small address. What I found was that one of these big corporations had a main building in a state capital, and then someone walked in with a few CDs of tens of thousands of businesses and changed the address from the main building for the main corporation to a 2-bedroom house outside of the big capital. And I'm looking, and I go by this address, and they've done it for hundreds of thousands of corporations, service of processes. And I saw this, and I was like, something's wrong. Right? I mean, that seems like a red flag, right?
It sure does to me. Absolutely. It is almost impossible for non-law enforcement to investigate crimes like this. You just don't have the tools. Law enforcement has lots of tools. You know, they have the search warrant powers, subpoena powers, grand jury powers, depending on the different level of government, to get the information they need. And the thing about fraud is that there is always some kind of trail. There's always some kind of paper trail, some kind of money trail, some kind of electronic trail. Law enforcement can find the fraudsters, if simply just by tracing the money. Who got the benefit of the money that was stolen?
What takes so long? In other words, there's always a trail. And you would think with a violent crime or a home burglary, there might not necessarily be a trial. But if you can close 20 burglaries in the times that one fraud, what's the thing that's so time intensive?
Well, I'll give you an example. So in sort of the real estate fraud world, I mean, the way it'll work is the detectives will send out sort of a first round of search warrants to get sort of some financial records, and those will go out. You know, maybe the banks will respond in 30 days. Maybe they need to be nagged. It'll take a while. In the meantime, the detective has set this case aside and is working on other cases. His or her mind is focused on other things. Finally, the responses, those documents come back in, and the detective has to dive back into the file, figure out, remember what he or she remembered at the beginning, and then go through all these documents looking for the smoking gun. And that's just time consuming. Typically, that will lead to another round of search warrants for more documents, you know, other accounts that they need the documentation from, which again will take time, 30 days. It could take longer if the banks don't respond. In the meantime, the detective sets it aside and works on other cases. And then when those documents come in, they have to refresh their recollection, get back into it. You can see how this process just drags on until you finally, and the really good detectives will structure their investigation in such a way that they don't tip off the perpetrator right away. They want to strategize and start way out at the periphery and slowly work their way in until they have enough information, and then they can go talk to the perpetrator. And that's kind of fun too. In California, detectives are legally allowed to surreptitiously record a defendant during an interview. And so the good detectives do what they call a soft knock search warrant. And so after they've done all these multiple rounds of search warrants and gotten documents, and they know exactly what happened, then they go to the bad guy's residence, and they'll go in plain clothes and knock on the door. The bad guy answers. They say, "Hey, we were assigned this case. Somebody's alleging that this transaction was fraudulent, and we just were hoping you could help us understand what's going on here." And con artists always think they can talk their way out of situations. That's what they've done their whole lives. They invite these detectives in. They offer them some coffee. They all sit down around the living room, and they start talking. And they weave this tale, this fantastic tale. And once they've stopped talking, the detective kind of nods and says, okay, I think I understand that, but I just don't understand how this document fits in. So they pull out a document that contradicts part of the story. And so then the criminal, the fraudster, starts changing their story just a little bit to get that document in there. And after they stop talking, then the detective does it again, pulls out another document, and okay, how does this fit in? At some point, the criminal finally knows they've been had, and says, "Okay, I'm done talking to you. You guys are gonna have to get out of here unless you have a search warrant." And then they say, "Oh, funny you should say. Here's a search warrant." Pulls it out, and their team of 15 other detectives are down the street around the corner. They come in and find all the documents that they need there in the house. It's so great to hear this all play out on audio tape. It's hysterical.
Good. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's heartening to hear from you and to hear about these stories, because really they don't get reported as much as they should. We went through the housing crisis, which seemed to just have no blame assigned to anyone, and that was frustrating, though, people that lost homes. But then again, you had people that all just lied and said, "Oh, I make $30,000 a month."
Yeah, that housing crisis, I have mixed feelings about it, because really, the fraud benefited everybody.
Yeah,
it benefited the appraiser, it benefited the real estate agents, it benefited escrow, title, the homeowner, the home buyer, the mortgage broker, the mortgage lender, the people on Wall Street who sliced and diced all of these mortgages. Everybody was benefiting from, the loose money and these stated income loans that enabled it to just keep going to, such great heights before it all collapsed. Everybody had a hand in it. Everybody had benefited from it. Now, people should have gone to prison, and I don't know if you've thought about that. Why did nobody at any high level go to prison during all of that? And there's actually a very straightforward answer. After 9/11, the federal law enforcement reassigned so many of their agents to anti-terrorism efforts that they were short-staffed in the fraud units when all this hit the fan. They just didn't have the resources to tackle the big fish. Now, there was probably political reasons too. I don't deny that, but there was also just a very practical, reason that they couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's we're trying to deal with all the fraud today. The fraud 14 years ago.
Right?
At some point we just have to cut our losses and try to clean up the current mess. Now, how much of the current mess is caused by not dealing with the previous mess remains, that there's an argument there that but then you have to go back to the 80s and the S&L scandals and all those other things. So it really does. Fraud is just kind of a part of the American identity, unfortunately.
It seems like there's a huge financial scandal about every 15 years, right? I think we're due for one.
The best crimes occur when the victim never knows it happened until it's so far late that they never come forward.
Well, that's absolutely true. Yeah, and that is the strategy. You don't want people to discover it until you're gone with the money. I mean, if you're a criminal, that's exactly right. You want to be an IRS whistleblower, a tax whistleblower, because you could end up getting 30% of all the taxes they end up collecting because of
the SEC also has payouts.
Something like that. Okay.
Yeah. Now the SEC is a program that they're supposed to route information out to appropriate agencies.
Okay.
Whether or not they do that remains to be seen. When I did talk to one of their lawyers, he's like, "We're just really busy."
I just learned John's retirement strategy, Clinton.
Actually, I mean, and it's funny. Like I was saying that we should go after nonprofits that are political yet use 501c status, C3, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Even ones that like to claim that they're schools, and you look at like how their political donations are skewed one direction. That seems to me like in a way that I think that there's like a gold rush out there for people to get these tax-free institutions taxed. If you can get University of Minnesota, for example, have them lose their status. I mean, they're involved in so many scandals over the last few decades, and they're highly political. That seems like an industry that that needs to be looked at. And it goes both ways.
I could see with you doing this show, talking about all these different types of scams, how it would be frightening to see just how widespread. I mean, it's scary. You know, it really is. It does feel like something has changed. People have given up on honesty because maybe they feel like everybody else is doing it. Why shouldn't I? But it does feel like there is a cultural shift that is allowing more of it. You know, there are other countries in the world where people just assume that people are trying to cheat them. You know,
right.
that's just they don't believe anybody.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like we're going to get to that point as well.
I mean, it's, you know, if we just thrive, if we exist in a chaotic world where everything's a scam, well, then we should be honest about it. You know, so that we are protected, because right now, grandma's walking down the street with a $100 bill hanging out of her pocket, and she doesn't know that she's surrounded by wolves because they're all dressed nicely and are friendly, but they're going to jack that purse, Granny. Run.
Yeah.
Hopefully Granny's got a gun in that purse too, but you know, it's a challenge, but you know, like when you found us on Twitter, I was like so happy because, you know, we focused a lot on vaccine injuries and these kind of things, but that's just low-hanging fruit, sadly, and they're easy to see.
And my big push right now is Veri-Lock. You know, I'm just trying to get that out to as many notaries as possible. We've had some counties that are very interested in doing pilot projects, including New York City. And here in California, Riverside County has been, you know, shown some interest, and Marin County of all places.
Really?
Yeah. So that's my push right now. You know, it's, you know, you cover so many different types of fraud on this podcast, but you know, I'm focused on that one thing. I will add that there, you know, you said you called the California Secretary of State and asked how they verify the identity of, you know, corporate officers and whatnot, and of course, you gave me an idea because, you know, a very simple and easy derivative of our Veri-Lock app would enable that to get done. And so there are all sorts of uses like that. Can I just talk about one other type of related fraud?
Please do.
So my partner has been in the real estate industry as a builder and developer for over 50 years. And the Veri-Lock app was actually his brainstorm, his inspiration, because he was a victim of a huge scam. About 15 years ago, there was a fraudster in LA who they called the Madoff of Beverly Hills, who may have stolen over $1 billion from all sorts of different people and charities and churches and synagogues. People had a lot of trust in him because he was the president of a regional bank. And my partner was a big victim of his. You know, this guy was able to forge documents and basically suck out the equity of some huge real estate holdings that were to be developed. Anyway, but with that background in the real estate construction industry, he also discovered other types of fraud, which is going to be our next app to prevent fraud in the building world. Because, so for example, you know, once a city signs off on architectural plans, then they need to somehow confirm that the building is being constructed according to those plans. And so in LA and many counties, what they do is they hire what they call deputy inspectors. These are private engineers who go out to the job site, verify that it's being built according to the plan, fill out an observation report, sign it, and stamp it with their stamp, just like a notary stamp.
Right.
And then the builder turns that into the city, and the city inspector looks at it and says, okay, it's signed off on. Well, as you can imagine, just like deeds, those observation reports are easily forged. Those engineering stamps are easily forged as well. And a couple of years ago, the LA District Attorney's Office prosecuted two guys who had been posing as licensed architects and engineers for a decade, forging stamps on documents.
Wow.
And the problem there is that, you know, if deed fraud is committed, people lose money, right? But if in the construction industry, people can lose lives. So if it's not built according to the safety specifications, I mean, those buildings could come down in earthquakes.
Right.
So, I mean, again, a simple derivative of our Veri-Lock app is the same sort of thing to verify that an actual verified engineer is there present at the scene, and that when the city receives a stamped document, they can verify that it is authentic. And so that's what we're working on next, and it's kind of an exciting project as well.
Well, I look forward to talking to you again, because I think I'm going to need an expert in white-collar crime for future interviews.
Very good. And if there's a particular topic, if you give me a heads up, I can do the research and get up to speed and talk with expertise about almost any fraud-related topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.